Welcome back to another crochet tutorial with Cozy Rosie UK, and today I'm going to be sharing with you how to crochet this super cute granny shell book cover. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and of course the notification bell so you never miss out on another one of my crochet patterns or tutorials again. Now this book cover can be adjusted to fit any size book. I am going to be using this hardback book. It currently has a very nice dust cover on it. This was bought for me at Christmas and I'm still to read it, but it is very much on my list. So whether you're covering a paperback or a hardback, you're going to be able to adjust the beginning chain to the height of the book. So we're going to measure our books before we start. I'm going to give you the pattern that is written to cover this pretty standard size hardback book. And remember, our crochet stretches, so we are going to be fitting it around the book, but we need to make sure that we've left enough room for it to stretch as we're using it, because it will. That is the nature of crochet. So we're going to end with quite a tight fit around the cover of this book, and there's going to be enough of a flap, much like this book cover, so you can use it as your kind of page holder as well, but obviously it's not going to damage the dust cover to do that. So the first material we're going to be using is of course our tape measure. I have one here, and yarn wise I have chosen a colour that reminds me of the cover of this book, which is this Premier Basics Mosaic. I was gifted a large amount of this way back in 2023, and this is actually one of the last skeins I have left. I made up one of my other granny stitch patterns in this yarn to create a beautiful shawl, and I loved how the colourway worked up. This is the colourway of Bouquet, and it is 100% acrylic, and it's classed as a size 4 or a worsted. This is generally a little bit thicker than standard Aran that we get in the UK. In fact, it's almost as big as a chunky. It's kind of, for us, it's a bit of a heavier weight in between. Now obviously, very usefully, it has how we can pull out our yarn. So there are of course two ends. I am going to be center pulling, and there is that center pull. Couldn't be as, it's one of the best things about both Red Heart does this and Premier Basics do this as well. I think there are a few UK brands slowly beginning to offer as a center pull, but it's just not as popular here in the UK. So this is the yarn that I'm going to be using. Now the recommended hook size is a 5.5mm. Well, I'm actually going to be using my 5mm hook on here. It's not going to change my tension too much to go down 0.5mm from what's the recommended hook. But if you're using any other yarn weight, go by the recommended hook size to create this pattern. We're also going to need, of course, a pair of scissors, a darning needle, and more importantly, I'm going to need about 4 stitch markers to secure the inside of our book cover before we finish off the seaming, because the seaming, and no sew, because you know how much I love sewing. So instead of sewing those edges down, we are going to work an edging around the book cover. So you'll find that when you're making the book cover, it's ever so slightly shorter than the height of this book. Let me move this out of the way so we can measure these books, because the way that we're going to measure them is we have, of course, the height of our book. So the height of this book is about 9.5 inches. That is pretty standard. On the reverse, it takes us to 24 centimeters. And then for the total wraparound element, I'm going to be adding in about a 4-inch flap inside our book, which looks really extreme, but that will help us to create quite a lot of stretch. So the finished rectangle that we're going to create to go all the way around this book is going to be 21 inches in total. So that's quite big. Let me find that on here. So that is about 54 centimeters. That's upside down. About 54 centimeters. So if I wrap that around this book, you can see that it goes around quite a lot, but that gives us the extra inches we need to create the inside flap to secure both the book cover to the book and to help make it fit really well and nicely. So gather your yarn and your hook and make sure you've measured your book, and we're going to get started on our beginning chain. If you are looking to create a smaller or a taller book cover, all you need to do is to adjust your beginning chain. I'm going to be doing the chain for a book that measures 9.5 inches tall, which is about 24 centimeters tall. If you want to adjust the beginning chain, you're going to be adjusting multiples of 6 plus 1 for the foundation. So for instance, for this size, we're going to be doing a beginning chain of 32, which will give us a stitch count at the end of row 1 of 31. So if you need to do a taller book, you're going to have to add on another 6 chains. So instead of doing 32, you would do 38. If you need to do a smaller book, you would subtract, sorry, 6 chains from 32, which would give you another number that I can't do in my head right now. Anywho, if you're making the same size book cover, so a 9.5 inch tall book, you're going to need to do a beginning chain of 32. I'm going to start by making a slip knot and placing that onto my hook, and then make my beginning chain of 32. So we're just yarning over and bringing it through 32 times. So that's 1, 2, 30, 31 and 32. So that is a multiple of 6, because 5 times 6 is 30, plus 1 for the pattern and 1 for the foundation gives us a beginning chain of 32. We're going to start by working into our second chain from hook. Remember, our loop doesn't count. We can't work into our first because it will come undone. So we're going to simply insert our hook into that second chain from hook. Now it's completely up to you whether you work underneath that top loop, or you can create a really neat edge all in one fell swoop by working into these back bumps. So instead of working into the top loop, I'm going to rotate over and pick up this back loop of my chain. So on the front you have 2 loops. If I turn it over, just behind you have that back bump, and I'm just going to encourage that on with my nail for the first one. Tighten everything up. And we're making a US single crochet, which is the same as a UK double crochet. So we're yarning over, bringing that loop back through, yarn over and pull through 2. Once you've worked that first one, those back bumps are a little bit more apparent. And remember, if you ever get lost, you can look for your beginning chain, your normal kind of side of your chain, and your bump will be just at the back there. So we're working 1 single crochet into each chain across, and I'm working into my back bumps to give a really neat start to our pattern, because on the front, where we haven't worked into those loops, we're left with what looks like the top of our stitch. If you're really clever, you can of course do a foundation single crochet, but I absolutely loathe doing them, and I'd rather take the time to do a single crochet into the back bump to create a neat beginning edge. So we're simply working 1 single crochet into each of our chains all the way back to where we started with our slip knot, and you should end row 1 with a stitch count of 31 single crochets. So continue on working row 1, and I'll meet you once you've worked into each chain. So once you've worked into each chain across, I'm just going to bring up a loop, and I'm going to measure this at this point. And we should roughly be, if it's laid flat, it should be a little bit bigger than the length we need for our book. So I want 9.5. If I was to lay this completely flat, it would just be a little bit bigger. And that's because we're doing a little bit of a lacy pattern. It will bring our beginning chain in ever so slightly. So if you are working a different size, that's a good place to check that you have enough length for your book. Mine does measure from the top to the bottom about 9.5 inches, so this is going to be absolutely perfect for that hard-backed book. At the end of row 1, you should have a stitch count of 31 single crochets if you're making the same size as me, or you should have a stitch multiple of 6 plus 1 stitch. So for example, if you were going bigger, you would have a stitch count of 37, for instance. Now going into row 2, we're going to begin with a chain of 3. So we're just yarning over and pulling through 3 times. Now that chain 3 does count as a double crochet, and we're going to work into the same stitch as our chain 3, working a further 2 US double crochets. So we're yarning over the hook, finding the bottom of that chain 3, and we're inserting our hook into the same as that chain 3. We yarn over, bring our loop up, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over and pull through 2 to create our US double crochet, which is the same as a UK treble crochet. We yarn over and we're working a second double crochet into that same as our chain 3. So we have our first 3 double crochet cluster, or as it's also known, our granny stitch. We're then going to skip the next 2 stitches. So we're skipping 1, skipping 2 before working into that next stitch along. We're yarning over because into that next stitch, after we've skipped 2, we're going to be working 3 double crochets. So we're just yarning over, bringing it up, pull through 2 and pull through 2. And we should make sure we've skipped 2 stitches in between. So we're working 3 double crochets all into that same stitch. So we're yarning over, reinserting into where we've just worked, working a further double crochet, yarning over for a 3rd time to work back into that same stitch, working our granny stitch once again, which is our 3 double crochet clusters. Now I am not placing chain 1s in between my granny stitches. This is to help prevent this pattern becoming too loose and reducing too much of the book cover showing through, just in case you're reading something you don't need everybody to see that you're reading. So once again, we're going to skip 2 before working our 3 double crochet cluster into that next stitch. So we're simply working 1, 2 and 3 all into that same stitch, creating a 3 double crochet cluster. We're going to continue to repeat that all the way across, skipping 2 stitches, followed by working 3 double crochets into the next, all the way across until we have just 1 stitch remaining, and that's where I'm going to meet you at the end of row 2. So we're skipping 2 and then working 3 double crochets. So, oops, flipped over there. So continue to repeat that all the way across by skipping 2 before working 3 double crochets into the next, and I'll see you when you have just 1 stitch remaining. Now when I say you have 1 stitch remaining, obviously part of the stitches you're skipping 2. So in theory you should have 3 stitches remaining, and we're going to yarn over and work our final stitch into that last stitch. So we're going to skip those last 2 and we're working 1 double crochet into that final stitch. Oh, my arm split. There we go. So at the end of row 1, you will have 10 3 double crochet clusters or groups, because that first one was 3 double crochets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10, and you'll have 1 double crochet. Going into row 3, we begin with a chain of 3. So we're yarning over and pulling through 3 times. We're going to turn and working into the same stitch as our chain 3. We're going to work a further 2 double crochets into that same stitch as our chain 3, just as we did at the beginning of row 1, really, row 2, sorry. Once you've worked those extra 2 double crochets, we are then going to work in between those groups of 3 double crochets. So although we don't have a chain 1, we're going to be working into that space there, and we are working 3 double crochets into that same space between those groups. They're not really a cluster, but I kind of think they are. So that's 1, 2 and 3, and then we skip across the next block into that space again, working 3 double crochets. We're going to repeat that all the way across and into that last space between our groups 2. I'm going to meet you when you've worked into this one, placing your 3 double crochets, ready to work our final stitch. So we are simply working between the 3 double crochet groups from the previous row, placing an additional 3 double crochets in between each of them. So continue across and I'll meet you once you've worked your final space, ready to work our final stitch of row 3 together. So once you've worked all the way across and into that last space there, We have 3 stitches remaining. We have the stitch, stitch, and then our beginning turning chain of the previous row. And it's there that we're going to place our last double crochet into the top of our turning chain. So we're yarning over, that's a stitch, that's a stitch. This is the top of our turning chain, and we're just going to aim our hook through the middle of the top of that turning chain and work a final double crochet. You should have the same stitch count at the end of row 3 of 10 3 double crochet groups and 1 double crochet. Now going into row 4, we are going to be working our granny shell stitch. So we begin with a chain of 1. We're going to turn and we're working into the same stitch as our chain 1, working a US single crochet. We're then going to make a chain 1 and we're going to be working into the middle double crochet of that previous cluster in the row below. So we're skipping 1 stitch and we're yarning over, ready to work into the middle stitch. So this one here, which is, we're skipping 1, working into the next, and we're working our granny shell. So we're going to work 3 double crochets. So that's 1, 2, and 3, all into that same stitch. We then make a chain of 1 before working into the same stitch once again, working a further 3 double crochets all into that middle stitch from the row below. So we're working 1, 2, and 3, all again once into that same stitch, and it creates that gorgeous shell with a chain 1 space in the middle. So we've worked all 6 of those stitches into that same stitch right there. We have 1, 2, 3 double crochets, a chain 1, and 1, 2, 3 double crochets, all worked into that same stitch. We're then going to make a chain 1. We skip the next stitch and the next, so we skip the next 2 stitches before working into this middle stitch of that next cluster. So we're going right into that middle stitch, working a US single crochet. We make a chain 1, we're skipping the next 2 stitches to work into the middle of the next, and we're repeating our granny shell once again. So we yarn over the hook, we've skipped those 2, working into that middle stitch, working 3 double crochets, that's 1, 2, and 3. We make a chain 1 before working a further 3 double crochets back into that same stitch once again. So that's number 1, 2, and 3. We make our chain 1, and then we're skipping the next 2 stitches before working a single crochet into the next and making another single crochet. So we're creating these lovely shells into this beautiful fabric with a single crochet in between. So we'll do one more together. So we're skipping 1, 2, working into the middle stitch of our next cluster, yarning over, ready to work our granny shell, which is made up of 3 double crochets, a chain 1, and a further 3 double crochets, and that's all worked into the same stitch. We make our chain of 1, we're skipping 1, skipping 2, working a single crochet into that middle stitch of the chain 3 cluster from the row below and making a chain 1. We're going to repeat that across, and I'll meet you for our final single crochet here, because it's going to be a little bit different because we are working into the top of our turning chain once again. So continue to repeat that across, working your granny shell stitch, a chain 1, and then you're doing a single crochet and a chain 1. I'll see you once you've got just 1 stitch remaining to work our final single crochet together. So I've just worked my granny shell into that last cluster there. Going to make a chain 1, and we have a full cluster here, but we're at the end of the row. So we're going to skip the next 3 stitches, working our final single crochet into the top of our turning chain from the row below. Just going to find the chain 3 from that previous row and pick up 2 loops of it to work that final single crochet. So at the end of row 4, you will have 5 granny shell stitches and you will have 6 single crochets. Going into row 5, we are going to start with a chain of 5. That's 2, 3, 4 and 5. Seems like a really long beginning chain, but this chain 5 counts as a double crochet and 2 chains because we're going to skip that first chain 1 space from below in the row, and we're skipping the first 3 double crochets, and we're simply working into the chain 1 space in the middle of our granny shell, and we're going to work 3 US single crochets into the middle of that shell. So we simply insert the hook, yarn over and work our first single crochet. We're going to make 3 all together, all into that chain 1 space. So that was number 1, number 2 and number 3. We're then going to chain 1. We're going to skip the next cluster and we're going to, and that chain 1 space, we're going to work into the single crochet from the row below, and we're working a double crochet into that stitch. So we're skipping all 3 and the chain 1, ready to work into that single crochet from the previous row, working a double crochet. We then chain 1, we skip that next block, and we're back to repeating 3 double crochets into that chain 1 space. So working 1, 2 and 3. We then chain 1. We skip that block, working into that single crochet from the previous row, working a double crochet. And of course, a chain 1. So what we're doing is we're kind of creating, it's just beautiful. I love the way this turns out. But we've got these 3 single crochets in the middle of our granny shells here, and it just looks really cute alongside the granny stitches in the previous row. So we're going to repeat this all the way across. Make sure you've done your chain 1 after your double crochet, then you're working 3 US single crochets into that chain 1 space with a chain 1 after. We're skipping that block before we work our double crochet. Repeating that all the way along, and I'll meet you once you've worked your 3 single crochets into that final chain 1 space to work our final double crochet together at the end of row 5. Just worked my final 3 single crochets and making my chain 1. To make us step across this last block and this extra chain 1 space, we're going to do an additional chain 1 to match the chain 2 at the beginning of this row. And then we're going to work a double crochet into the top of that single crochet from the row before. So we're yarning over, and it's all the way down here. It's quite low down. So if you turn to the side, you should see the top of your stitch. That's your chain 1 that we created. And then you've got your single crochet there. We just need to pick up 2 loops from that single crochet and work without splitting our yarn, which I've obviously done. There we are. And work and work a double crochet. At the end of row 5, you're going to have 15 single crochets. You're going to have 6 double crochets. And of course, you're going to have 2 chain 2 spaces, 1 at each end. Going into row 6, we begin with a chain of 3. We're going to work 2 US double crochets into that same stitch as our chain 3. So that's 1 and 2. We're then going to work 3 double crochets into the middle stitch of those 3 single crochets. So we're skipping the chain 2 space, skipping that first stitch and working into the middle one. If it's like mine, it will be sticking up a little bit, so really easy to find. And we're just working 3 double crochets into that same stitch. That's 1, 2 and 3. So we're working our granny cluster. We're going to skip that next stitch, skip that chain space. We're working into the top of that double crochet from the previous row, and we're working our granny stitch once again. So that's 1, 2 and 3. And we're simply going to repeat that all the way across, working into the middle stitch of those 3 single crochets, working our 3 double crochets. So that's 1, 2 and 3. We're then going to work into the top of that double crochet from the previous row, working our granny stitch of 3 double crochets once again. We're going to repeat that all the way across to the end where I'm going to meet you, because we have that chain 2 and we need to make sure we place our last stitch very carefully. So continue to repeat that across, working into your middle stitch of your single crochets from the previous row, and then you're working into the double crochet in between those chain 1 spaces. Working my final double crochet into the middle of those single crochets, and we are back to where we had that beginning chain 5. We're going to work into the 3rd chain of that turning chain. Now, if you're already familiar with working your back bumps from working your chain, or you can rotate it to count them, but I can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chains. So you're kind of aiming for the middle of that chain that you created, working into the 3rd chain. Or you can just count 2 back. So 1, 2, you're working into the 3rd. Either way you count up, you're kind of working into that middle chain from that chain 5 that we created. And although it looks like it's pulling in, it really isn't. See how much easier, see how it just stretches out into the right position. So at the end of row 6, we're back to our stitch count of 10 3 double crochet groups and 1 double crochet. For row 7, we are simply repeating row 3 where we work our chain of 3. We work 2 double crochets into the same as our chain 3, same stitch as our chain 3. And then we're working in between those 3 double crochet groups, working a further 3 double crochets. So that's 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to repeat that all the way across, and I'll meet you for our final stitch for the repeat of row 3, where we work into the top of our turning chain with 1 double crochet. I'll see you in a moment, because we are all set to repeat and create the rectangle we need to make our book cover. So once you've worked all the way across, working into those spaces between those 3 double crochet groups, we are going to be working 1 double crochet into the top of our turning chain. So we skip those last 2, placing a double crochet into the top of that turning chain. At the end of row 7, you will of course have 10 3 double crochets and 1 double crochet all on its own. So for the remainder of your book cover, you are going to be working rows 4 to 7 a further 8 times for a total of 39 rows. Remember, we did that first row, even though that's the start of our repeat. So we're going to work those 4 rows, rows 4 to 7. They are time stamped for you, and you're going to repeat them 8 times. And then I'm going to meet you for our final row, which is row 40, which we'll do together. Once you've worked all of those rows, we're ready to work that final row. Have your stitch markers handy, because we're going to be folding, seaming and edging all in one go. So you can carry on now to repeat rows 4 to 7 a further 8 times, and I'll see you once you've done that for our final row. So once you have worked all 8 repeats, you should have quite a substantial rectangle here. We're going to work row 40 together, and it's a nice easy one. We just need to match the edging that we started with. So we're going to work a row of single crochets. We begin with a chain of 1, which does not count as a stitch, which means that we're going to work a single crochet into the same as our chain 1, and then we're simply working 1 single crochet into each stitch across. We need to work our final stitch into the top of our turning chain from the previous row. It's going to be a little bit tight for some reason. There we are. Just working our final single crochet, and at the end of row 40 you should have 31 single crochets. I'm going to make a little chain 1, and I'm going to fasten off. And I'm going to fasten off because we only have 2 ends at the moment, and then we're going to go on and fold our book covers. So get these 2 ends woven in, grab those stitch markers, because we are ready to edge and seam our book cover all in one go. Once you have completed that row, I'm not weaving my ends in. I know I should, but if you have woven your ends in, well done. We are then going to be folding and pinning or securing our edges to the size of our book. Now obviously, ideally you'll have your book with you, but if you don't, we just need to make sure that we have folded on a measurement. So we've added an extra 3.5 inches for our fold. Oh, bang on. And we want to make sure that we're doing the same amount on both ends, and that's really important. It's hard to go by the rows because obviously it's a 4-row repeat, so we're going to end up ever so slightly different. So even if they're looking like they're different, they're probably not. So I'm going to pin these edges together, and I'm making sure that I'm running down the same row when I'm putting these edges together. That's my stitch marker that just broke. So we're just going to pin the edges together and kind of secure these into position. Excuse the clock bonging in the background. Just making sure that it's running all the way down the same row. And we're looking for about a 3.5 inch fold for this size book. And we can of course try it on, but it's not going to be too secure. If you wanted to try it on with your actual book, it is supposed to be too small, remember, because we want it to stretch over our book. So that's that side on. You see, we want it to be a tight fit because it will stretch. And once these edges are secured, it's going to be even tighter to get on, but it's going to be so worth it because we don't want the cover to be overly loose. And once we've worked our edging around, it's going to fit absolutely perfectly. And we have this nice deep fold into our book as well. And by the time we've done our edging all the way around, we'll be covering this book perfectly. So once you've tried it on, let's move on to joining and seaming the edges of our book covers. We're going to work the edge along this side before repeating it on the other side. Now what we want is for the edge to be showing on the right side of our project, which is when it's closed. You also want the right side of your fabric facing you. And obviously whichever side you feel is prettiest of your stitches is going to be the right side. For me, that means that I have the right side of my granny shell facing out. So I've got the wrong side of my rectangle on the inside and all folded. And then when I've closed, all the right side's going to be facing. So when we're rejoining the yarn, we're going to have the right side of the book cover facing us with the flaps on the inside, so that when we have our seam all the way around the edge, the right side of our seam or edging is going to show all the time. So we're going to locate where we've pinned our panels together and we're joining in this space here, ideally through 2 stitches. I'm just going to insert my hook first through the stitches because we need to work through both sides. Have I done that? Not really. Just take a moment to kind of, oops, get through the whole stitch on both sides, and then I'm ready to rejoin my yarn. I'm just going to place it with a tail at the back and bring it through and make a little chain 1 to secure. And what we need to do is to work a single crochet evenly across these row ends. So I'm going to work back through the stitch that we just joined in, working that first single crochet where that chain 1 is. And then I'm just going to evenly work through my chain where they come and through the row ends. And we're just going to evenly place, oh, sorry, this yarn is splitting as I'm pulling through. That's not fun. There we go. Just going to evenly work through the row ends all the way across. By working through both edges evenly, we're going to join them to create that fold in our book cover. And of course, we're creating a nice little edging all at the same time. So we're just going to work across these row ends on both sides. Just evenly placing single crochets. You don't want it to be too loose. You don't want it to be too tight, so you want to get a nice edge along there. And we want to just check that it's not squishing up our stitches too much on either side of our project, and that's secured that flap all the way along. We're then going to work through these row ends, working single crochets evenly across these row ends, and generally we're working 2 US single crochets per row end. So you can work around the chain into the row end. That's 2, there's another one, and then into the top of that row end there. I'm going to work through the chain here, that hole's pretty big. And we're just doing it as evenly as possible without adding too many stitches, because what we don't want to do is to force the fabric to stretch before it's even in use. So we're just working into the chains or around the chains, ideally through them, because it does help to add stability to your project. And we're working into the row ends as well, working 2 single crochets across each row end. Once you've worked all the way across the top and you've reached your next stitch marker, I'm just going to insert my hook through where the stitch markers are before I remove them, so I know I've got the right place. Then we can remove our stitch markers, and we're just continuing to repeat that join all the way across to back to the end of those edges. We're just continuing to work those 2 single crochets across these row ends, working through both sides of the flap to secure the book. Oh, I'm struggling with this yarn. There we are. It's a little bit fiddly towards the end. You just need to make sure that you've got the right, point that you're working those last few stitches into. I'm going to just work one there. And because we have that extra stitch at the end, I'm just going to try and work through it just to give it a nice edge. It's nearly impossible. That might kind of be it. It looks terrible. Just going to work a single crochet there, and then we can fasten off. Nice long tail, obviously, to help us with weaving in. And then we have one side of our book cover all seamed. We're going to repeat this for the other side, making sure that we have lined up our rows as perfectly as we can, and repeat that process all the way across from the other side. Once you've repeated that on the other side and you've woven your ends in, you are ready to insert your book. Of course, it is up to you whether or not you leave the dust cover in place. I've removed it because this book is coming with me on holiday, and I like to keep my dust covers super tidy. So I have simply inserted my book into this lovely book cover, and I can proudly read whatever I want with nobody knowing what I'm reading. Thank you so much as always for joining me. I will see you in the next video.